The polished marble floors reflected sterile fluorescent lights as Maya stepped into the bank lobby. The hum of keyboards and murmured conversations paused briefly, eyes flicking toward her. A black woman in a tailored pantsuit. Her presence, unchallenged but unwelcome. A receptionist glanced up, her smile tightening. "Can I help you?" Maya met her gaze evenly. "I have an appointment with Richard Hayes." The receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard. "Name?" "Maya Carter." A beat of silence. The receptionist's eyes darted to a security guard lingering near the elevators, then back to Maya. "Take a seat. He'll be with you shortly." Maya nodded, settling into a leather chair. Across the room, a white couple in casual wear approached the receptionist and were ushered to a banker's desk immediately. Maya's hands rested lightly on her lap, her composure unshaken. The security guard adjusted his stance, his eyes tracking her. She ignored him, pulling out her phone to review notes. Minutes ticked by. The receptionist finally gestured toward the elevators. "Third floor. Mr. Hayes's office is on the right." Maya stood smoothly, her heels clicking against the marble. The guard stepped forward, blocking the elevator. "ID, please." She handed it over without a word. He scrutinized it, then her face, before nodding curtly. Inside the elevator, Maya's reflection stared back. Calm, determined. The doors opened to a hallway lined with mahogany doors. Richard's nameplate gleamed. "Loan manager." She knocked. "Once." "Come in," a voice called. Richard Hayes sat behind his desk, fingers steepled. His eyes swept over her, lingering a moment too long on her outfit. "Ms. Carter," he said, not rising to greet her. Maya stepped forward, extending her hand. "Mr. Hayes." He shook it briefly, his grip loose. "Let's see what you've got." Richard's gaze flicked briefly to Maya's folder before settling on his computer screen. He tapped the desk with his pen, a rhythmic sound that filled the silence. "You know," he began casually, "these applications are rarely approved. For businesses like yours." Maya tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. "Businesses like mine?" Richard didn't look up, his focus fixed on the screen. "Small businesses in competitive markets," he clarified, though his tone carried an unspoken implication. He tapped the folder lightly with his pen. "It's not personal, it's just the numbers." Richard had barely skimmed Maya's file. The financials were impeccable. Consistent growth, strong credit history, and a detailed plan for expansion. But to him, none of that mattered. She was another risk, another statistic in a system designed to exclude people like her. Maya's hands rested calmly on her lap, her composure unwavering despite the subtle insult. She watched as Richard leaned back in his chair, his confidence palpable. "Policy is policy," he said finally, gesturing toward the folder as if it were already decided. Maya didn't respond immediately. Her silence stretched just long enough to make Richard glance at her, his smirk faltering slightly under her steady gaze. "Have you reviewed my financials?" she asked quietly, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. Richard chuckled softly, leaning forward again. "I don't need to. I know how these things usually turn out." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken prejudice. Maya inhaled deeply, but kept her expression neutral. She reached for the folder slowly, her movements deliberate. "Thank you for clarifying," she said softly, standing up with quiet dignity. Maya stood still, the folder in her hands, her calm expression betraying none of the frustration simmering beneath the surface. She glanced at Richard, who was now typing something on his keyboard, his attention already drifting away from her. "Have you even reviewed my finances?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. Richard paused mid-typing, his fingers hovering over the keys. He looked up at her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't need to," he said, leaning back in his chair. "I've been doing this a long time. I know how these things usually turn out." Maya's grip on the folder tightened slightly, but she didn't respond immediately. The room felt heavier now, the silence between them charged with unspoken tension. Richard seemed to take her silence as agreement. He chuckled softly and gestured toward the door. "Look, Ms. Carter, I'm sure you're very passionate about your business, but passion doesn't always translate to success." Maya's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "Success?" she repeated. Quietly, her tone measured. "Yes," Richard said confidently. "The numbers don't lie." Maya's numbers were flawless, better than most applicants he had approved without hesitation. But Richard hadn't even opened the file beyond its cover page. To him, she was already a risk not worth taking. Maya took a slow breath and stepped forward slightly, placing the folder back on his desk with deliberate care. "You might want to take another look," she said evenly, her gaze locking onto his. Richard blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the quiet intensity in her voice. But before he could respond, Maya turned and walked toward the door without another word. Maya reached the door but paused, her hand resting lightly on the handle. The room was silent except for the faint hum of Richard's computer. She turned slowly, her gaze steady as it met his. "You should check your records again," she said calmly, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. Richard froze, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. For the first time, his smirk faltered. He leaned forward slightly, narrowing his eyes at her as if trying to decipher her meaning. "Excuse me?" he asked, his tone sharp but uncertain. Maya didn't repeat herself. She held his gaze for a moment longer before turning back to the door and stepping out without another word. The confidence he had displayed moments ago was suddenly replaced by unease. He glanced at the folder on his desk, the one he had dismissed, so casually, and hesitated. His hand hovered over it, but he didn't open it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, his mind racing with questions he didn't want to ask aloud. Outside, Maya walked down the hallway with measured steps, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Her composure remained intact, but her thoughts churned with quiet determination. Richard's arrogance wasn't new to her. It was a reflection of a system she had been fighting against her entire life. Back in the office, Richard stared at the door Maya had just exited through, his confidence wavering further with each passing second. The silence in the room felt heavier now, pressing down on him in a way he couldn't explain. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper as young Maya sat on a hard plastic chair, her legs swinging just above the floor. Her mother, dressed in her best Sunday blouse, leaned forward across the desk, her hands clasped tightly together. "Please," her mother said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "I've been with this bank for years. I've never missed a payment." The loan officer, a middle-aged white man with a stiff tie and colder eyes, barely glanced at the papers in front of him. He tapped his pen against the desk rhythmically, the sound sharp and dismissive. "Policy won't allow this," he said flatly, leaning back in his chair as though the conversation was already over. Maya's small fists clenched in her lap. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she could feel the weight of it. The way her mother's shoulders slumped slightly, the way the man's tone made her seem smaller than she was. "I just need a little more time," her mother pleaded. "This loan could help me keep us afloat." The man sighed audibly, shaking his head. "I'm sorry," he said, though there was no apology in his voice. "It's out of my hands." Maya stared at him, her young mind memorizing every detail. His dismissive tone, his cold smile that didn't reach his eyes. Her mother stood slowly, gathering her papers with trembling hands. "Thank you for your time," she whispered, though Maya could hear the strain behind the words. As they walked out of the bank, Maya looked up at her mother's face, tired but composed, and felt something shift inside her. She didn't know what it was then, but it hardened into resolve over time. This will never happen again. Richard leaned casually against the edge of his co-worker's cubicle, the faint hum of the office filling the silence between them. In his hand, he held Maya's loan application folder, unopened. He tapped it lightly against his palm, a smug expression settling on his face. "She's just another risk we can't afford," Richard muttered, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. The co-worker, a younger man with nervous eyes, glanced up from his computer screen. Did you, review her file? He asked hesitantly. Richard chuckled, shaking his head. Don't need to. I've seen this story before. He gestured vaguely toward the folder. Small business, high competition, and, well, you know how these things go. The younger man shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. But what if her finances are solid? Richard's smirk widened as he leaned closer. Look, she's not the type we're looking for. It's not personal. It's just policy. Richard had no intention of reviewing Maya's file. To him, her presence alone was enough to decide her fate. The system had always protected him, allowing him to hide behind vague terms like risk assessment and policy. The younger man nodded slowly but didn't respond. His silence was complicit, a quiet agreement with a system he didn't have the courage to challenge. Richard straightened and tossed the folder onto his desk with a casual flick of his wrist. "Let her down easy," he said over his shoulder as he walked away. The coworker stared at the folder for a moment before turning back to his screen, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on him. The conference room was silent except for the faint scratching of a pen against paper. Maya sat at the head of the long mahogany table, her posture straight, her expression calm but resolute. Across from her, the bank's legal representative slid the final set of documents toward her. "This will officially complete the acquisition," the representative said, his tone professional but tinged with curiosity. "Congratulations, Ms. Carter." Maya nodded, her gaze fixed on the dotted line. Her hand hovered over it for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Years of exclusion, rejection, and systemic barriers had led her here, to quietly reclaim what had once been denied to her family. She signed with steady precision, her pen gliding across the paper as though sealing a promise. "This ends here," she whispered under her breath. The representative glanced at her but said nothing, sensing that this was more than just a business transaction. Maya stood outside the bank as a teenager, watching her mother's tired face after yet another loan denial. The memory of that moment had stayed with her, shaping every decision she made as an adult. Now she was taking back what had once been used to keep them out. Maya handed the signed papers back to the representative and stood slowly. She didn't smile or celebrate. There was no need for theatrics. Her victory wasn't about applause. It was about transformation. As she walked out of the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, she paused briefly at the entrance and glanced back at the bank's logo etched into the glass doors. For the first time, it felt like it belonged to her. The office was quiet except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. A single mother sat across from Richard, her hands gripping the edges of her purse tightly. Her credit report lay neatly on the desk, flawless, without a single blemish. "I've never missed a payment," she said softly, her voice trembling but steady. "I have everything you asked for." Richard leaned back in his chair, flipping through the papers with a practiced air of disinterest. He nodded absently, his eyes barely scanning the details. "Policy won't allow this," he said finally, closing the folder with a definitive snap. The woman blinked, her lips parting slightly as if to protest, but no words came out. She looked at him, searching for something, empathy, fairness, but found only indifference. "Policy?" she repeated weakly. "Yes," Richard replied, his tone clipped. "Risk assessment guidelines are very clear on cases like this." Her finances were impeccable, but Richard had already decided she wasn't worth the risk. To him, she was just another statistic. A single mother in a system designed to exclude people like her. The woman's shoulders slumped slightly as she gathered her papers. "Thank you for your time," she whispered, though her voice carried the weight of resignation rather than gratitude. As she stood to leave, Richard glanced at his computer screen, already moving on to the next task, as if she had never been there. Maya watched this same scene unfold years ago as a teenager. Her mother sitting across from a loan officer who dismissed her with similar coldness. The memory burned into Maya's mind, shaping her resolve to change spaces like this forever. The tension in Richard's office was almost palpable as Maya sat across from him, her calm demeanor a sharp contrast to his dismissive arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the desk. "Like I said, Miss Carter," Richard began, smirking slightly, "it's just not a good fit. Our policy is very clear on these matters." Maya didn't respond immediately. Her hands rested lightly on her lap, her expression unreadable. Across the room, her assistant shifted uncomfortably in their seat, their fingers brushing against the phone in their pocket. Richard continued, oblivious to the growing tension. "You can try again in a few years, when your numbers are stronger," he added, his tone dripping with condescension. The assistant's hand moved slowly, pulling out their phone and angling it discreetly toward Richard. The camera lens caught his smirk, the way he barely glanced at Maya's file before dismissing it entirely. Maya tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but firm. "It's interesting," she said quietly. "You haven't even opened my finances." Richard chuckled, leaning forward slightly. "I don't need to," he replied confidently. "I've been doing this long enough to know how these things usually turn out." The assistant's grip on the phone tightened as they hit record, capturing every word. This wasn't just about Maya. It was about everyone who had been dismissed by people like Richard without a second thought. Maya stood slowly, gathering her folder with deliberate care. "Thank you for your time," she said evenly, her gaze lingering on Richard for just a moment longer before turning toward the door. As the door clicked shut behind her, the assistant ended the recording and stared at the screen, their heart pounding with quiet determination. The video was uploaded late that evening, the caption simple but powerful: "Racism in corporate spaces must end." Maya's assistant stared at their phone screen, watching the view count tick upward faster than they'd expected. Within hours, the hashtag #BankingWhileBlack began trending. Comments flooded in, each one a story of exclusion and quiet pain. "This happened to me, too." "Denied for no reason despite perfect credit." "Hold them accountable." Richard sat at his desk the next morning, sipping coffee as he scrolled through his emails. At first, he didn't notice the growing buzz around him. The whispers by the copier, the glances from coworkers who quickly looked away when he caught their gaze. It wasn't until his phone buzzed with a notification that he realized something was wrong. He opened the link hesitantly, his coffee mug trembling slightly in his hand. The video played on his screen, his own voice echoing back at him. "I don't need to. I know how these things usually turn out." The smirk on his face was unmistakable, captured in perfect clarity. His confidence drained as he scrolled through the comments beneath the video. Each one felt like a blow. This is why systemic racism persists. How many others has he dismissed like this? He glanced around the office, noticing for the first time how quiet it had become. Co-workers avoided his gaze entirely now, their whispers sharper and louder than they had been moments before. Richard's grip tightened on his coffee mug as he refreshed the page again, hoping the video would disappear. But it didn't. The world was watching now, and there was no escaping it. The break room was unusually quiet, the hum of the refrigerator and faint clinking of mugs the only sounds filling the space. Two coworkers stood near the water cooler, their voices low but urgent. "Did you see the video?" one whispered, glancing toward the door nervously. The other nodded, their eyes darting to Richard's office down the hall. "Yeah, it's bad," they murmured. "Really bad." Richard stepped into the break room suddenly, his presence cutting through their conversation like a knife. The two coworkers stiffened immediately, their smiles forced and fleeting as they avoided his gaze. "Morning," Richard said casually, though his voice carried an edge of unease. He poured himself a cup of coffee, his movements slower than usual. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the coworkers exchanged glances, neither willing to speak again. Richard turned slightly, catching their expressions, tight-lipped, awkward, and distant. The whispers weren't just about him, they were about what he represented, a system that had thrived on exclusion and dismissal for decades. The weight of judgment pressed down on him, heavier with every passing second. One coworker cleared their throat and muttered, "Well, I should get back to my desk." The other nodded quickly in agreement, both of them leaving the room without another word. Richard stood alone now, his coffee untouched in his hand. He stared at the empty doorway where they had exited, his confidence unraveling further with each moment of silence that followed. He glanced at his phone on the counter beside him and hesitated before picking it up again. The video was still trending. #BankingWhileBlack. And the comments beneath it were relentless. For the first time, Richard felt what it was like to be on the outside looking in. Richard sat in the corner of the conference room, his chair slightly turned away from the others. A projector flickered on, casting a pale glow over the wall as the bank's senior leadership reviewed their loan policies. The tension in the room was thick, every word measured, every glance sharp. "This is the policy in question," one of the executives said, pointing to a section on the screen. The words, "Risk Assessment Guidelines," loomed large, vague, and impenetrable. "It's been in place for years." Another executive leaned forward, his tone clipped. "And it's been weaponized to deny loans disproportionately to marginalized communities." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers gripping the armrests tightly. He had always hidden behind this policy, using its ambiguity as a shield. Now that shield was being stripped away in front of everyone. A committee meeting years ago. Richard sat at this same table as a younger man, listening as a colleague proposed reforms to make loan approvals more equitable. "We're not a charity," another member had scoffed, dismissing the idea with a wave of his hand. Richard had nodded along silently, complicit in maintaining the status quo. Back in the present, an HR representative spoke up, her voice firm. "These policies need to change immediately. The video has exposed more than just one incident. It's exposed us." Richard's face burned as all eyes briefly flicked toward him before darting away again. No one spoke directly to him, but their silence was louder than any accusation. The meeting ended with murmurs of agreement and a promise to rewrite the guidelines. Richard remained seated as others filed out, his chest tight with the realization that his excuses were no longer enough. Maya's assistant sat alone in their small apartment, the glow of their phone screen lighting up the room. The video was still trending. Millions of views, thousands of comments. Their thumb hovered over the screen, scrolling through the flood of reactions. "This is exactly why we need change. I've been through this too. Hold them accountable." They set the phone down, their hands trembling slightly. They had recorded the video impulsively, driven by anger and frustration at Richard's dismissiveness. But now, as the fallout grew, they couldn't help but wonder if they'd done the right thing. "What if it's too much?" they whispered to themselves, their voice barely audible in the quiet room. "What if I made it worse?" The guilt weighed heavy on them, guilt for exposing Richard so publicly, guilt for dragging Maya into a storm she hadn't asked for. They picked up their phone again and stared at the view count, climbing higher and higher. A knock at the door startled them. Maya stepped inside, her expression calm but thoughtful. She glanced at the phone on the table and then back at her assistant. "You're worried," Maya said softly, sitting down across from them. The assistant nodded hesitantly. Was this the right move?" Maya studied them for a moment, before replying. "Truth doesn't ask for permission," she said simply. "It demands to be seen." Her words hung in the air, steady and unshakable. The assistant exhaled slowly, their shoulders relaxing slightly under her calm reassurance. As Maya stood to leave, she paused at the door and glanced back at them. "You didn't make it worse," she said quietly. "You made it visible." The assistant nodded silently as Maya walked away. The room was dimly lit, the only light coming from a desk lamp casting a soft glow over Maya's notes. She sat quietly, her pen resting between her fingers as she stared at the words she had written. The faint hum of voices outside the door reminded her that the press conference was minutes away. This wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had been dismissed, silenced, or told they didn't belong. The weight of their stories pressed against her, but it didn't break her. It steadied her. A knock at the door broke the silence. Her assistant peeked in, their face pale but determined. "They're ready for you," they said softly. Maya nodded, but didn't move immediately. She glanced at her reflection in the mirror across the room, a woman who had fought her way into spaces that were never meant for her. Her calm exterior belied the storm of emotions beneath, but she knew this moment wasn't about emotion. It was about action. Meanwhile, down the hall, Richard sat in his office, isolated and tense. His phone buzzed on his desk, but he didn't pick it up. The whispers he had ignored all day now felt deafening, each one sharper than the last. "HR wants to talk to you," a colleague had hissed earlier, their tone clipped and distant. Richard's stomach churned as he replayed those words in his mind. Back in the quiet room, Maya stood slowly and smoothed out her blazer. She picked up her notes but didn't look at them again. She didn't need to. Her message was clear in her mind. As she stepped out into the hallway, the voices grew louder, the cameras waiting just beyond the door. The murmurs of the crowd faded as Maya stepped up to the podium, the bank's main hall suddenly still. Cameras flashed, capturing her calm posture, shoulders squared, gaze steady. In the back corner, Richard sat rigidly, his fingers digging into the armrests of his chair. "Thank you for being here," Maya began, her voice clear and unwavering. A reporter near the front leaned forward. "Ms. Carter, what do you say to allegations that this incident reflects systemic racism in banking?" Maya paused, letting the weight of the question settle. "This isn't just about me," she said finally. "It's about everyone who's been told they don't belong here." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound echoing like a verdict. Richard's knuckles whitened as he gripped his chair, his jaw clenched tightly. A journalist turned toward him suddenly. "Mr. Hayes, why did you dismiss her application?" Richard froze, his throat tightening. "I was just, following policy," he croaked, his voice cracking under the stars of his coworkers. The bank's policy had always been a shield for bias. A committee member smirking, "We're not a charity," as equitable reforms were voted down. Maya's gaze locked onto Richard from across the room. "This institution belongs to me now," she announced, her tone calm but unyielding. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Richard's face drained of color, his smugness crumbling into disbelief. Maya's pen hovering over the acquisition papers, her hand steady as she whispered, "No more gatekeepers." Co-workers edged away from Richard, their whispers sharp. "He's finished," one muttered. The crowd's applause morphed into chants. "Accountability now!" Phones recorded Richard's unraveling, sweat beading on his forehead, eyes darting for an exit. Maya gestured to a plaque unveiled behind her. "This bank serves everyone." The cheers drowned out Richard's shaky exhale. He stumbled out a side door, the echoes of her speech haunting him. Outside, a janitor paused, nodding at the plaque. "About time," they murmured. Richard kept walking, his shadow swallowed by, the crowd still chanting inside. Maya stood at the podium, her fingers resting lightly on its edges. The room was packed, reporters, community leaders, and bank employees all waiting for her to speak. The air felt heavy, charged with tension and anticipation. She scanned the crowd briefly, her gaze lingering on Richard, sitting stiffly in the back. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale as he avoided eye contact with anyone around him. "This isn't just about me," Maya began, her voice steady but deliberate. "It's about everyone who's ever been told they don't belong here." The silence that followed was deafening. Then, applause erupted like a wave, filling the room with a unified energy. Maya didn't smile or react, she simply waited for the noise to settle before continuing. Richard's knuckles whitened as his grip tightened on the armrests of his chair. He had always believed in his authority, his ability to dismiss people like Maya without consequence, Now that authority felt fragile, exposed under the harsh light of public scrutiny. Maya's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts again. This is about dismantling systems that thrive on exclusion, systems that hide behind words like policy and risk. The applause returned, louder this time as people rose to their feet. Richard stayed seated, frozen in place as the sound reverberated around him. A reporter turned toward him suddenly, microphone in hand. "Mr. Hayes, would you care to comment on your decision to deny Ms. Carter's application?" Richard opened his mouth but hesitated, his voice cracking as he stammered, I was just following policy." The crowd's reaction was immediate. Whispers and murmurs spreading like wildfire as Maya stood silently at the podium, her calm presence speaking louder than any rebuttal. The applause faded, replaced by the sharp clicks of cameras and the low hum of murmurs. Richard sat frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. The air around him felt suffocating as reporters began shifting their focus toward him. A journalist in a gray suit stepped forward, microphone in hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice cutting through the room like a blade, "why did you dismiss Ms. Carter's loan application without reviewing her financials?" Richard's throat tightened. He glanced around the room, searching for an ally, but found only averted gazes and stiff shoulders. His voice cracked as he stammered, I was just following policy." The journalist didn't back down. "Policy?" she repeated, her tone sharp. "Can you elaborate on what part of the policy justified your decision?" Richard shifted uncomfortably, his confidence unraveling under the weight of her question. It's standard risk assessment," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. Another reporter chimed in from across the room, his voice louder. "Standard risk assessment? Ms. Carter's finances are flawless. What exactly made her application a risk?" He had always relied on vague terms like policy to shield himself from accountability. But now, under the relentless gaze of the cameras and the crowd, those words felt hollow, exposed for what they truly were. I didn't mean," Richard began, but his voice faltered as another journalist stepped forward with a pointed question. "How many other applicants have you dismissed without justification?" The room fell silent again, all eyes on Richard as he struggled to find an answer. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he realized there was no escape from this moment. The room was still, save for the faint hum of the projector as a slide flickered onto the screen. The words, "Risk Assessment Guidelines," loomed large in bold letters, their vagueness now a glaring flaw under the scrutiny of the crowd. A senior executive stood at the front of the room, his voice calm but firm. "This is the policy in question," he said, gesturing to the screen. "It's been in place for over a decade." Maya sat quietly in the audience, her expression unreadable, but her presence commanding. She watched as the executive continued, his tone growing sharper. "These guidelines have allowed for subjective decision-making, decisions that disproportionately affect marginalized communities." Richard sat near the back, his body stiff and unmoving. He had always hidden behind policies like this, using their ambiguity as a shield. Now that shield was being stripped away in front of everyone. Years earlier, Richard sat in a similar meeting as a younger man. A colleague had proposed reforms to make loan approvals more equitable. "We're not a charity," another member had scoffed, dismissing the idea with a wave of his hand. Richard had nodded along silently, complicit in maintaining the status quo. Back in the present, an HR representative spoke up, her voice cutting through Richard's memories. "These policies need to change immediately," she said firmly. "The video has exposed more than just one incident. It's exposed us." The room buzzed with murmurs of agreement as employees nodded solemnly. Richard's face burned as all eyes flicked toward him briefly before darting away again. Their silence was louder than any accusation could have been. As the meeting adjourned, Richard remained seated, staring at the screen as if it held answers he couldn't find. The room buzzed with tension as Maya stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She paused at the podium, her hands resting lightly on its edges. The crowd leaned in, sensing something monumental was about to unfold. Richard sat near the back, his posture rigid, his eyes darting nervously, between Maya and the reporters scattered across the room. He had always believed himself untouchable, protected by a system that rewarded dismissal with silence. But now, that silence had been shattered. Maya's voice broke through the murmurs, calm and deliberate. "This institution belongs to me, now," she announced, her words slicing through the air like a blade. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a stunned silence. Richard's face drained of color as he stared at her, his smugness crumbling into disbelief. His grip on the armrests of his chair tightened as if they were the only thing keeping him grounded. A reporter near the front stood abruptly. "Miss Carter," she said, her voice trembling slightly with excitement. "Are you saying you own this bank?" Maya nodded once, her composure unshaken. "Yes," she replied simply, "and under my leadership, it will serve everyone equally." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the room with a sense of justice long overdue. Richard shrank further into his chair, sweat beading on his forehead as he tried to process what he had just heard. Maya signing the acquisition papers months earlier, her hand steady as she whispered to herself, "No more gatekeepers." Back in the present, Maya's gaze locked onto Richard briefly before turning back to the crowd. Her calm presence spoke louder than any accusation ever could. The room was quiet except for the faint scratch of a pen gliding across paper. Maya sat at the head of a long table, her posture straight, her expression calm but resolute. Across from her, the bank's legal representative slid the final set of documents toward her. "This will finalize the acquisition," he said, his tone professional but tinged with curiosity. "Congratulations, Miss Carter." Maya nodded, her gaze fixed on the dotted line. Her hand hovered over it for a moment, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't just a business transaction. It was an act of reclamation, a quiet, calculated move to take back what had been used to exclude people like her for generations. She signed with steady precision, her pen gliding across the paper as though sealing a promise. "No more gatekeepers," she whispered under her breath. The representative glanced at her but said nothing, sensing that this was more than just a routine deal. Maya, as a teenager, standing outside this very bank with her mother after another loan denial, her mother's tired face etched itself into Maya's memory, an image that had fueled every decision she'd made since. Back in the present, Maya handed the signed papers back to the representative and stood slowly. She didn't smile or celebrate. There was no need for theatrics. Her victory wasn't about applause. It was about transformation. As she walked out of the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor, she paused briefly at the entrance and glanced back at the bank's logo etched into the glass doors. For the first time, it felt like it belonged to her. The hall was alive with murmurs, but none of them reached Richard. He sat slumped in his chair, his once proud posture now hunched. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that resembled support, but all he found were turned backs and averted gazes. Near the coffee station, two co-workers whispered to each other, their voices low but sharp. "He's finished," one said, glancing briefly in Richard's direction before looking away. The other nodded, their tone clipped. "HR's already involved. Did you see the press conference?" He didn't even try to defend himself. Richard's jaw tightened as he caught fragments of their conversation. The authority he had once wielded so effortlessly now felt like a distant memory. The same people who had laughed at his jokes and nodded along in meetings now avoided him. Like a plague, he stood abruptly, hoping to assert some semblance of control, but his legs felt unsteady beneath him. As he moved toward the group near the coffee station, they dispersed quickly, their whispers trailing off into silence. "Morning?" Richard said awkwardly to no one in particular, his voice cracking slightly. No one responded. The silence was deafening, louder than any accusation could have been. He turned back toward his office, the walk down the hallway feeling infinitely longer than it ever had before. Every step echoed with the weight of judgment, unspoken but undeniable. As he reached his desk, he noticed an email notification flashing on his screen. Meeting with HR. Urgent. His stomach churned as he clicked it open, the words blurring together as panic set in. For the first time in years, Richard felt small, like a man who had been stripped of everything he thought made him powerful. The room buzzed with energy, the applause from Maya's announcement still echoing off the walls. Reporters leaned forward, cameras flashing, phones recording every moment. The crowd's attention shifted to Richard, whose face was pale and glistening with sweat. A reporter stepped closer, microphone in hand. "Mr. Hayes," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the noise, "do you deny dismissing Ms. Carter's application without justification?" Richard opened his mouth to respond, but hesitated, his throat dry and tight. I was following policy," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the murmurs spreading through the crowd. Another journalist chimed in from across the room, louder and more direct. What part of the policy justified rejecting a flawless application? Was it her business plan or something else? Richard's grip on the podium tightened as his eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The vague terms he had relied on for years, risk assessment, policy, now felt flimsy and exposed under scrutiny. The murmurs grew louder, turning into whispers that spread like wildfire. He's lying. It's obvious what happened. How many others has he done this to? The crowd began to shift emotionally, their applause morphing into chants. Accountability now! The words echoed through the hall like a verdict, each repetition hammering at Richard's crumbling confidence. Phones captured every bead of sweat on his forehead, every flicker of fear in his eyes. He glanced toward the exit but found it blocked by reporters eager for answers he couldn't give. Maya stood silently at the podium, her calm presence commanding the room without a single word. The crowd had become her jury, and Richard had already been sentenced in their eyes. Maya stepped back from the podium, her movements deliberate and calm. The crowd's chants of accountability now softened as their attention shifted to the unveiling behind her. A velvet cloth hung over a plaque mounted on the wall, its edges gleaming under the bright lights. She turned toward it, her hand resting lightly on the cloth. "This institution will no longer be a place of exclusion," she said, her voice steady but resonant. "It will serve everyone." With a single motion she pulled the cloth away, revealing the plaque beneath. The words etched into it were simple but powerful. "This bank serves everyone." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a wave of applause that filled the hall. Maya didn't smile or bask in the moment. She simply stepped aside, letting the plaque speak for itself. Richard stood frozen near the back of the room, his gaze locked onto the plaque as if it were condemning him personally. The words felt like a direct challenge to everything he had upheld. A system built on exclusion, masked by professionalism. A reporter moved closer to Maya, their voice trembling with emotion. "Miss Carter," they asked, "what inspired this? Change?" Maya paused before answering, her tone measured. "Years of silence," she said simply, "and the refusal to accept it any longer." The applause swelled again, drowning out Richard's shaky exhale as he backed toward the exit. His presence felt smaller now, overshadowed by Maya's quiet strength and the plaque that would remain long after he was gone. As Maya turned back to face the crowd, her gaze lingered on the plaque for one final moment. A symbol of progress, etched in metal. Richard stumbled through the side door of the hall, his steps uneven and hurried. The echoes of Maya's speech still reverberated behind him, each word cutting deeper than the last. The crowd's chants, "Accountability now!" grew fainter as he moved further away, but they lingered in his mind like a haunting refrain. For years, he had walked these halls with confidence, his authority unquestioned. Now, every step felt heavy, his presence unwelcome in a space he had once controlled. Outside, the air was cool and quiet, a stark contrast to the charged energy inside. Richard paused near the parking lot, leaning against the wall to catch his breath. His shirt clung to him uncomfortably, damp with sweat. Janitor pushing a cart stopped nearby, glancing at Richard briefly before turning toward the building's entrance. They paused as their eyes caught the new plaque mounted beside the door. "This bank serves everyone." The janitor nodded to themselves, their voice low but firm. "About time," they muttered before continuing on their way. Richard's gaze followed them, then shifted to the plaque. The words stared back at him, unyielding and permanent, a declaration of change that left no room for people like him. He turned away quickly, his movements stiff and awkward as he headed toward his car. The authority he had relied on for years was gone, replaced by isolation and judgment from those who had once supported him. As he drove out of the parking lot, the building grew smaller in his rearview mirror. The plaque remained visible until it disappeared entirely, a reminder of what he had lost and what Maya had reclaimed. Richard's boss slid a single sheet of paper across the desk, avoiding eye contact. "Effective immediately," he said flatly, staring at his computer screen. Richard didn't move. His throat tightened as he read the words. Termination of employment. "Why?" he asked hoarsely. His boss sighed, still not looking up. "You know why." The office buzzed around them. Keyboard clicks, muted phone calls, laughter from a nearby cubicle. No one glanced at Richard's way. "I was following policy," Richard said, his voice cracking. His boss finally met his gaze, his expression cold. "Policy changed." Richard opened his mouth to argue but stopped. The weight of unspoken truths pressed down on him. The viral video, the ignored complaints, the colleagues who now pretended he didn't exist. He picked up the letter, his hands trembling slightly. The walk to his desk felt endless, every step echoing with whispers he couldn't decipher. At his cubicle, a coworker hurried past, eyes fixed on the floor. Richard reached out. "Jen, wait!" She flinched and kept walking. The authority he'd once worn like armor now felt like a prison. He stuffed his belongings into a cardboard box and left without saying goodbye. Richard sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the glow of his laptop screen casting harsh shadows across his face. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional buzz of his phone. He ignored the notifications, unwilling to face what they might contain. On the screen, job postings scrolled endlessly. Each one seemed to mock him. Inclusivity training required. Commitment to diversity and equity is a must. He clicked on a few out of habit, but closed them just as quickly. He knew he wouldn't get a call back. The world had moved on, leaving him behind. His inbox was empty, save for automated rejection emails from companies he had applied to. The words blurred together as he read them. "Thank you for your application. Unfortunately, we are unable to move forward at this time." Richard leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples as frustration bubbled up inside him. He had always thought of himself as someone who followed rules, someone who did his job well, but now that image was shattered, replaced by a man who had become a symbol of exclusion and bias. The viral video played in his mind again. Maya's calm defiance, his dismissive smirk, the way he clutched his clipboard like it could shield him from accountability. Her words echoed in his head. Leadership isn't about power. It's about creating spaces where no one feels invisible. Richard glanced at his phone on the table beside him as it buzzed again. Another text from Emily. "Dad, we need to talk." He stared at it for a long moment, but didn't respond. The weight of regret pressed down on him, heavier than he'd ever imagined. The silence in the apartment grew heavier now, louder than any confrontation could have been. Richard scrolled through his contacts list, his thumb hesitating over familiar names. He had worked with some of these people for years, shared coffee breaks, office jokes, and long shifts, Surely someone would understand. He tapped on a name and typed a message. "Hey, it's Richard. Just wondering if you've heard of any openings? Hope all is well." He hit send and stared at the screen, waiting for the three little dots to appear. They never did. His inbox was filled with polite but distant replies, or worse, silence. "Sorry, nothing right now." "Good luck with your search." Some messages went unanswered entirely. Richard tried calling an old co-worker he'd been close to, someone who used to call him Buddy during shifts. The phone rang twice before going to voicemail. He left a message anyway. "Hey, it's Richard. Just check in. Give me a call when you can." Days passed without a response. The realization crept in slowly but surely. He had become a pariah in the very circles he once relied on. The people who used to greet him warmly now avoided him entirely, their silence louder than any words could have been. At work, it had been whispers and side glances. Now it was outright avoidance. He scrolled through social media and saw former colleagues posting about new jobs, promotions, and team outings, events he wasn't invited to or even informed about. Richard leaned back in his chair, his phone slipping from his hand onto the table. The isolation felt suffocating, like the walls of his apartment were closing in on him. He thought back to Maya's words at the press conference. Exclusion isn't always loud. It's often silent. He hadn't understood it then, but now he felt it deeply. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his phone lying face up in front of him. The screen lit up again with a notification, another text from Emily. "Dad, we need to talk." He stared at the message, his jaw tightening. It wasn't the first time she had reached out since the video went viral, but he hadn't replied. What could he say? Emily had always been the one to challenge him, to question his decisions in ways that made him uncomfortable. He had dismissed her concerns before, but now her words felt heavier, louder in his silence. Years ago, Emily had confronted him after a family outing to the mall. "Why were you following my friend around the store?" she had asked, her voice trembling. With frustration, Richard had waved her off dismissively. "Just being cautious," he'd said, as though it were nothing. Her response echoed in his mind now. "You made her feel like she didn't belong." Back in the present, Richard picked up his phone and reread Emily's latest message. He imagined her sitting in her dorm room or at a cafe somewhere, waiting for a reply that might never come. The guilt gnawed at him, sharper than before. He wanted to explain himself, to tell her that he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that he was just doing his job. But even as he thought it, he knew it wouldn't be enough. His fingers hovered over the keyboard before he set the phone down again. The weight of her judgment pressed down on him like a stone. The room was silent except for the faint buzz of the refrigerator as Richard sat there, unable to move. The atmosphere inside the bank had shifted entirely. Under Maya's leadership, the sterile, exclusive environment that once defined the institution was replaced with warmth and purpose. The walls now displayed art from marginalized communities, vibrant paintings and photographs that told stories of resilience and hope. Policies were rewritten to prioritize equity and inclusion, removing vague terms like risk assessment that had been used to justify exclusion. A mentorship program was launched for marginalized entrepreneurs, offering guidance and financial support to those who had been denied opportunities for years. Maya walked through the main hall, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. She paused to watch a young black woman sitting with a banker, her face lit with excitement as she reviewed her loan approval documents. The bankers smiled warmly, their interaction genuine and respectful, a stark contrast to what Maya had experienced in the past. Maya, as a teenager, sitting across from a loan officer who barely glanced at her mother's application before rejecting it. The coldness of his tone, the dismissiveness in his eyes, they had stayed with her for years. Back in the present, Maya exhaled slowly, letting the weight of that memory fade as she watched the woman leave with her head held high and her loan approved. A staff meeting was taking place in one of the conference rooms. The diverse team discussed new initiatives with enthusiasm, their voices filled with purpose rather than obligation. Maya stepped inside briefly, nodding at them before continuing her walk through the building. This wasn't just about reclaiming a space. It was about transforming it into something better than it had ever been before. The entrance of the bank gleamed under the soft afternoon light. A small crowd had gathered outside, murmuring quietly as they waited for the unveiling. Maya stood near the door, her hands clasped in front of her, her expression calm but purposeful. A velvet cloth covered the new plaque mounted beside the entrance. It was small, understated, but Maya knew its significance would resonate far beyond its size. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. The murmurs quieted as all eyes turned to her. "This institution has been a symbol of exclusion for far too long," she began, her voice steady. "Today it becomes something else, a place where everyone belongs." With a single motion, she pulled the cloth away, revealing the plaque beneath. The words etched into it were simple but powerful. "This space belongs to everyone." For a moment there was silence. Then, one by one, people began to clap. The sound grew louder, filling the air with a sense of hope and renewal. Maya stepped back, letting the plaque speak for itself. This wasn't about erasing the past, it was about acknowledging it and building something better in its place. Nearby, a young man paused to read the plaque. He smiled faintly before walking inside, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested he felt welcome here for the first time. Maya watched him go, her gaze lingering on the plaque for a moment longer. It was just a sign, metal and words, but it carried the weight of everything she had fought for. As she turned to rejoin her team inside, she whispered quietly to herself, "This is only the beginning." The community center buzzed with energy, its walls adorned with posters celebrating local entrepreneurs. Maya stood near the entrance, watching as young business owners set up their presentations. Laptops clicked, voices murmured, and the faint smell of coffee filled the air. The center had been funded by the bank's new initiative, a program designed to support marginalized entrepreneurs who had been overlooked for years. Under Maya's leadership, the bank had become a lifeline for those who had been told they didn't belong in spaces like this. A young woman approached the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her microphone. "My name is Tasha," she began, her voice soft but determined. "And I'm here to pitch my idea for a sustainable clothing line." Maya watched from the back of the room as Tasha spoke with growing confidence. Her presentation was clear and passionate, her ideas innovative. The audience nodded along, some jotting down notes while others smiled encouragingly. Maya, as a teenager, sitting in a similar room but feeling invisible. She remembered watching others speak while knowing she wouldn't be given the same chance. Not because she lacked talent, but because of who she was. Back in the present, Maya exhaled slowly, letting that memory fade as Tasha finished her presentation to a round of applause. One of the mentors stepped forward to shake Tasha's hand. "We'll be in touch," he said warmly. Maya smiled faintly as she watched Tasha leave the podium with her head held high. This wasn't just about giving opportunities. It was about creating spaces where people could thrive without fear of being dismissed. The living room was dim, the curtains drawn tightly to block out the afternoon sun. Richard sat slouched in, his armchair, his phone glowing in his hand. The viral video played again, its sound muted, but its impact deafening. He watched himself smirk at Maya, dismissing her calmly stated request with the words, "I was just following protocol." The scene replayed over and over in his mind, the way he had clutched his clipboard like a shield, the smirk that had felt so natural at the time but now seemed grotesque. He couldn't escape it. The video was everywhere. Comments flooded beneath. This is systemic racism in action. How many times has this happened to people without power? He should be fired immediately. Richard's phone buzzed on the coffee table, breaking his trance. He glanced at the screen. Another text from Emily. "Dad, we need to talk." Her words lingered like an unanswered question, heavy with disappointment and urgency. He thought, back to the last real conversation they'd had years ago. Emily had confronted him about following her black friend around the mall. "Why'd you do that?" she had asked, her voice trembling with frustration. Richard had waved her off dismissively. "Just being cautious," her response echoed in his mind now. "You made her feel like she didn't belong." Richard rubbed his temples as regret clawed at him. He had dismissed her concerns so easily back then, convinced that he was doing the right thing. But now, faced with the consequences of his actions, he couldn't ignore what he had done, not just to Maya, but to countless others who had been made to feel invisible because of people like him. The silence in the apartment grew heavier as Richard stared at Emily's text again. His fingers hovered over the screen, but he couldn't bring himself to reply. The cafe inside the bank was quiet, the soft hum of conversation blending with the faint clinking of cups and plates. Maya sat at her favorite corner table, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea. The sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a gentle glow across the room. This wasn't just a cafe. It was a symbol of transformation. A space that had once been cold and exclusive now felt welcoming, alive with diversity and purpose. She watched as guests moved through the room, their interactions unguarded and natural. A young black man in a tailored suit sat with an older, white woman, discussing business plans over coffee. Nearby, a group of teenagers admired the artwork on the walls, pieces created by local artists who had once been overlooked. Maya, as a teenager, sitting in a similar space but feeling out of place, she remembered the stares, the whispers, the quiet judgment that had made her feel small. Back in the present, Maya exhaled slowly, letting that memory fade as she sipped her tea. Her gaze lingered on a young woman across the room who was reviewing loan documents with one of the bank's new mentors. The woman's smile was wide and genuine, her posture relaxed as she signed the papers with confidence. This wasn't just about reclaiming what had been denied, it was about creating something entirely new. A space where no one had to question whether they belonged. She leaned back slightly in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug as she watched the room buzz with life and purpose. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply feel the weight of it all, the struggles, the triumphs, and the quiet joy of knowing how far they had come. The bank's main hall was quiet now, the day winding down as employees tidied their desks, and guests trickled out. Maya stood near the entrance, her gaze fixed on the plaque mounted beside the door. "This space belongs to everyone." The words gleamed under the soft glow of the overhead lights, a quiet but powerful declaration. The journey hadn't been easy. Every step had been met with resistance, from dismissive smirks to outright denials, but she had refused to let silence win. This plaque wasn't just metal and words, it was a promise, a reminder of what could be achieved when silence was broken. She turned to look back at the room behind her. The cafe buzzed with quiet energy, guests mingling freely without hesitation or fear of exclusion. A young woman laughed softly as she shared ideas with a mentor. A black teenager pointed excitedly at a painting on the wall, his friends nodding, in agreement, as they admired the details. Maya, as a teenager, standing outside this very bank with her mother after another loan denial. Her mother's tired face had stayed with her for years, a reminder of the spaces they were told weren't meant for them. Back in the present, Maya exhaled slowly, letting that memory settle before turning toward the door. She paused briefly, her hand brushing lightly against the edge of the plaque. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she whispered to herself, her voice steady but soft. "But it starts when we refuse to accept silence as an answer." The words lingered in the air as Maya stepped outside into the fading sunlight, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Behind her the plaque gleamed, a lasting symbol of transformation.